Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are, it's breakfast somewhere. So eat up. Welcome to Breakfast with Vinny. Food for thought. So today's guest is an acclaimed music historian, a jazz critic and author, musician, and all-around musicologist. He's authored 11 books, the most recent being Music, A Subversive History, which I'm in the process of reading at this very moment. It's an amazing, amazing book. And most recently was featured prominently in the media regarding an article that he authored called Is Old Music Killing New Music? So speaking of food for thought, please welcome Ted Gioia. Ted.
Well, hi, Vinny. Thanks for having me as your guest.
Thanks for being on the show, Ted. So, man, oh man, this is amazing. There's just no shortage of brain food here. I've got to tell you that this book is so enthralling, just in its scope alone. That it, I mean, without giving too much of it away, I would definitely recommend anybody who has an interest in the sort of all-encompassing, big picture of music, please have a read at it. And you're also involved in a jazz studies program at Stanford. Is that right?
In the past, I helped set up a program some years ago, but I haven't been teaching for a while. Most of my teaching now is just done via writing. But yes, I do. I did teach at Stanford. And that was an extraordinary experience, which I benefited from. I'm sure you know this too. Sometimes as a teacher, you learn things by being forced to deal with students. You find that there are a lot of things you know how to do, and you're not, and you have, by articulating them, you understand them more clearly yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the limited amount of teaching that I've done, I've found, I mean, that I've had to sort of, not only think about that and revisit what it is that I'm trying to impart, but how to articulate it, and which ties into the whole process of it. So absolutely, it causes you to do that, and I think some people definitely have a gift at that, just naturally, But it can be developed too. It's one of those things, and the whole educational thing now is so, there's so much of it going on. There's definitely not a lack of information out there. But honestly, we were talking not long ago on the phone, and and it was interesting because our conversation just immediately had wings. And I remember telling you, I said, we have to save this for the show because there's so much to talk about. And it's interesting because just in your book, like, we're talking about the origins of music and what gets accepted and touted in society. I mean, for that matter, what about breakdancing? I mean, shouldn't that be an Olympic level sport? Or what about parkour? These are death-defying acts, and they arise from people's desire to just do them, to be adventurous and daring and explore. And it's amazing just what, the things that become legitimized later and then filtered or sanitized, where they actually come from. And, I often wonder about those things. And like I was just saying, like parkour, for example, I mean, or just people playing in the street, that I see. There was, I remember, there was a group in the Congo, I think, and they fashioned all their instruments out of these sort of recycled parts. And the music that they came up with was amazing, and what I also found equally interesting was that, we would hear that over here on this side of the pond, and we think, yeah, that's really original, and which it is, and which it's very unique. But then I think someone was asking one of the people in this particular group about anything that might have influenced them. And the answer was James Brown. So, it was kind of like it went over there and and came back over here, and this kind of cyclical thing, so which is was I think a lot of what you talk about, so.
Well, everything comes full circle. And you're right, it's remarkable what becomes legitimized and what doesn't. We were talking a little earlier about jazz education, and you made the comment that there's a lot of jazz education materials out there, and there really are. But when I was coming up, and maybe this dates me a little bit, when I was coming up, there was very little. I grew up in LA. I was trying to learn how to play jazz when I was a teenager. And I never went to a school that had a jazz program or even a jazz class. And I spent many years in advanced education at some really fine institutions. None of them had any jazz offerings. The only good method book I could find back when I was a teenager was this 4-volume work by John Mahagan called On Jazz Improvisation. And even that was a little bit clumsy and cumbersome. There was no things like YouTube videos. Occasionally, you'd get your hands on a transcribed solo. And that was remarkable to be able to see I remember when the Charlie Parker Omni book came out, which had all these Charlie Parker transcribed solos. This was extraordinary. And then I remember I went to college. It's the early 1970s. And my sophomore year, one of the students from New York, I was at Stanford, so we're on the West Coast, we're sort of cut off from what's happening back east. But my friends from New York had a copy of the real book. And he showed me the real book. And my eyes went so wide. Something like this even exists?
Right.
The funny thing is now we've come full circle. People laugh at the real book, or if you use fake books or these. They complain about these students that have learned too much at school and they're too well trained. But in a way, I'm envious, because when I was coming up, jazz was not legitimate. A lot of the music I loved wasn't considered legitimate, would never be taught at a school. And obviously there are downsides when things become too academic, but I think I'm grateful for the most part that these things now are taken seriously. And if you do want to learn, there are resources out there, because man, not long ago, there was nothing.
Yeah, I know. And you're talking about these things. I know because I'm of the same sort of era and age bracket. I mean, you and I are in that similar sort of, bracket. So you said John Mahagan. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that, and the real book and all of those things. And the same for me when I was coming up, it was like, well, I had to transcribe things myself. And if I would go to see people play, I had to either retain it or not, and just try to use my imagination and figure it out. And I wonder, if that sort of having to work that hard at it actually, has a beneficial effect that may or may not be missing today. And it's hard to say, because there is much more material that's easily available in forms that didn't exist back then. And, it's easy to say, well, look, it's all out there, in front of you, and you're being spoon fed. But at the same time, as a result of that, I see a lot of young players today that are coming up that the bar has just raised, at certain levels of at school levels that didn't exist before. And they're just sort of, regardless of how easy the information is to obtain, they still have to apply themselves. So the level seems to have raised. So it's kind of a tough argument to pose, in that sense, not for the sake of argument, but you know what I'm saying? It's like, having to engage your imagination and versus sort of just having it all there right in front of you, and on the other hand, I've also noticed a lot of homogeneity that's happened as a result of that as well. So,
No, we may have gone from one extreme to another, but
yeah.
I like to tell myself that if I had had access to the tools we had now, I would have learned faster. But there was something, you learned at a deep level. Mm-hmm. If you had to do it the way we did. Because the way you described it, I used to go out to the club and I would try to sit right behind the piano players. So I could actually watch. I'm sure you were probably sitting by the drummer. You're trying to it's like drinking from a fire hose because it's coming out so fast.
Absolutely.
Uh, and it was a different way of learning, but you picked up things at a deep level doing it in that kind of way. So I don't know which is better, but at times I am a little envious. And when people complain about these young jazz students who learned this, that from a method book and from a video, I think, well, I would have loved to have that method book and video,
Yeah, no,
back
I
in the
know.
day. So,
I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I did exactly what you said. I remember once I had to do this a clinic overseas, and I had to play before the late great Tony Williams, who is my hero. So as it turned out, he started playing, and it was in Scotland actually. And we all took this van over to the auditorium, and Tony was in really a great mood. He was telling jokes, and I remember that well. And so anyway, we got there, and I played, and a bunch of us played, and then Tony came on, and of course, you can just imagine when he started playing, and he played for about 45 minutes nonstop, and we were all just standing there shaking our heads. But what happened was, I was standing off to the side of the stage, and then I suddenly just went down and belly crawled across the stage, right behind his riser, right behind him. And then a friend of mine who was also on the same bill, called Keith LeBlanc, he did the same thing. So the next thing you know, we're both there on our stomachs looking up at Tony right behind him. I mean, if he would have swished his head and sweat, it would have fell on us. And we were watching just the entire thing. And he played and played and played nonstop. And then he stopped, and he turned around and motioned toward his tech. And he said, and the tech ran over, leaving us alone. And he said, "How long did I play?" And the tech said, "About 45 minutes. And he said, "Okay." And he toweled himself off. Now it was question time. So somehow we still went unnoticed as he got up to do his sort of question and answer thing. Cut to months later, I got this story secondhand, even though I'd spoke to Tony on the phone several times. What happened was, I found out from one of the other people that he was watching a VHS of this thing at home, and as he's watching it, apparently he said to his wife, "Wait a minute, could you pause that tape right there? Rewind it. What is that motion?" It's somebody crawling across. It's Vinny. What is he doing? I was caught red-handed, belly crawling across the floor.
Yeah, you didn't think it was going to be on film, but,
I didn't. But hey, it happened. So
well,
yeah, right. But it's interesting too, because now we can document so many things, and it's like, again, for me, I see a sort of pros and cons to it, where all this information is available and this, that, and the other thing. On the other hand, it becomes like, well, I have to post all the time, and and then there's that danger of homogeneity, of everybody sort of jumping on the same bandwagon. But one thing is I think that we could sort of trace, at least at a certain point in history, since this started happening, it actually began documenting things in a way that can be recovered easily on social media or whatever it is. I mean, like, how could you, like, without chronicling history well, how is it possible, for example, to really know, like, to really, really know who played the very first Boogaloo beat, for example? Just putting that out there. Like, I remember, like, we could say, okay, Clyde Stubblefield, J-Bo Starks, but I remember once a record that Papa Joe Jones put out. He did it. You know this record. It was called The Drums, and so he put that record out and he chronicled his history, where he was citing his travels and seeing people on the way that influenced him, that maybe just were on a first name basis, like with some weird nickname like a Mr. Curly or something. And they probably perhaps they went into the vast unknown of society, unheard of, except for Papa Joe telling us of them and what they did, that we may have otherwise never realized, or people that were around at the time of Louis Armstrong, and the people that, you know what I'm saying? It's
Absolutely. No, my next book, I'm going to be writing about this, about where does musical innovation come from? This is an issue of great interest to me, and I've spent decades trying to grasp it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've seen is that when these innovations come out, they're not recognized initially as innovations. Sometimes they're scandals, sometimes they're controversies, sometimes people will just say, well, they're doing it wrong. And because of that, as a music historian, I've seen that the origin of almost every major innovation is surrounded by mystery. And I'll just give you a few examples. We now believe the first jazz musician is someone named Buddy Bolden, but there's no recording. There's absolutely no recording. If you go to the origin of the blues, there's a fellow named W.C. Handy who's called the father of the blues, but he'll tell you that he first heard it at a train station in Tutwiler, Mississippi, where he heard someone playing the blues on a guitar. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't even know the name of that person. And I could go example after example, and people will tell me, well, Ted, that's just because these are popular forms of music. And I said, no, if you got a room full of experts on classical music and asked them who invented the symphony, who invented the fugue, who invented the sonata, just wait and watch the argument start. Because even in the most theoretically respectable kinds of music, no one can agree on these things because no one was documenting it. No one was paying attention. And usually it was a scandal, even something as simple as polyphony. When they started singing multiple parts of counterpoint in church, this was a scandal. Palestrina, the composer, had to go to the Vatican and defend polyphony. So and if you go back even further, chant, you would think, well, what could be offensive about Gregorian chant?
Right.
But the people that Saint Benedict had people threaten his life. He invented the Benedictine chant. And I'll just give one more example.
Yeah.
The guy who invented musical notation, Guido d'Arezzo, he was the first person to figure out how to write down music. Mm-hmm. People tried to kill him. And I know when I tell people that, they say, oh, that can't be true, Ted. What could be so threatening about music notation? I said, you have to understand, before people could write down music, if you wanted to learn a song, you had to go to the choir master. You had to go to a person. They were very powerful because they knew the music. And if you wrote it down, people didn't need them anymore. So you were threatening people's livelihoods.
Right.
By just writing down music. And this is, and I've been able to trace this going back 5,000 years.
That's incredible.
Every new style of music has led to controversy, and usually the history is effaced. I'll give one last example. The first singer-songwriter is named Enwedanna. It's not a name that's well known, but this is ancient Mesopotamia. We're going back 5,000 years. She wrote the first songs that actually survived that we can attribute to an individual. But the stone on which this thing is inscribed has been broken and defaced because someone wanted to destroy that music. Now, who knows what was going on? Yeah. But as far back as you can trace, when something new happened in the music world, someone else tried to erase it.
Just resistance constantly. But I mean, that's not only in music, but to not get too tangential here. That reminds me, wasn't there a book written about that very thing? The Lexicon of Musical Invective?
Oh, Slonetsky. Yeah, no, there would be, and
Yeah.
yeah, no. And if you go, for example, I like to go back to the first reviews. And if you go back to Bach, it's hard to find music reviews. There are a few comments where people say this is dangerous, he's pushing the envelope, we got to stop him. But by the time you get to Beethoven, it's all documented in the press. Beethoven debuts his Third Symphony. People attacked him immediately. Someone jumped up in the audience and screamed an insult in the middle of the performance. So this is the way innovation is always treated. Most of the time, the history is hidden from us, but when you can get the details, and I've spent a lot of my life trying to piece together these details, the story is always one of resistance. And that probably hasn't changed today. Sad to say,
No, it doesn't seem like it has at all. So if we think we're, unique in that regard, in this point of history, we're obviously sadly mistaken,
Oh, absolutely.
And then that's what history teaches us. That's incredible. I think, it's amazing that all of these things are viewed as threats to either some kind of hierarchy or any number of things that they're birthed in such a painful manner. I remember, it was, well, okay. You're talking about also, especially in your book here, where things that are integrated into society and cleansed and sanitized, for that matter, are initially considered vulgar or shocking. And do you think that that the eventual integration and acceptance into society of what was initially considered vulgar and shocking can be compared to like the normalization of steadily increasing vulgarities in general, like, just other things? Do you think, and do you think that the music directly contributes to it, or causes it, or as a result of it? Those vulgarities could be, or they could include the acceptance of violence and general erosion of ethics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I like to ask the question, is there a music so extreme it can't be assimilated? And some people would say, well, look at some of this gangster rap or hip hop. But I'll tell you, in the last few years, the Smithsonian is now putting together the Smithsonian Collection of Hip Hop. And they've gathered 50 scholars of hip hop to help them create a canonical collection. The Library of Congress is doing this. There's a registry of cherished American recordings. It's the National Registry of Recorded Sound. They've taken, Straight Outta Compton is now in that. That was an album the FBI tried to shut down when it came out. And I think that music always starts by shaking things up, and people want the music to shake things up. I think that's part of what people want from music, is they want some disruptive experience that expands their horizons. But it changes, and we forget, and we shouldn't forget. For example, I tell people who know about jazz, and they say, well, jazz is now taught at Juilliard, there's jazz at Lincoln Center, there's jazz is taught at Harvard. And I said, well, you need to remember, the first jazz song we know about that Buddy Bolden did was called Funky Bud. And if I sang you the lyrics, it would be shocking.
Wow.
If people used to sing that song in New Orleans, the police would arrest them. And the club where Buddy Bolden played, if we can believe Jelly Roll Morton, he said that there would be several murders would take place per night at that club. Now, I assume Jelly Roll was exaggerating, but even if you tone it down a little, let me ask you, Ben, you've lived through this. You work very closely with Frank Zappa.
Yeah.
Who is now a venerated composer.
Yeah.
But you have to, I'm sure you could tell me chapter and verse. He shook things up when he came to town, did he not?
Yes, he did. He definitely did. So, in a way, that can answer a lot of my questions, but in another way, it still leaves some questions unanswered. But he definitely did. And I mean, even myself as a young kid, I mean, in the seventh grade, listening to Mothers of Invention, and I was sort of, I appreciated the eclectic music, the musical part of it, as well as the sort of built-in satire that was hilarious to me. Um, and sort of not just a satirical part of it, but the anti-establishment. There was a lot of things built into it societally, but
Yeah, no, I mean, I had those albums and I felt like I had some sort of contraband.
yeah,
And I
exactly.
had these, I remember in high school, I got these Mothers of Invention albums
Yeah.
and was like, wow, this is, gotta hide these from my parents. This
Oh
is,
yeah. Yeah,
this is,
absolutely.
this is some extreme stuff. But that's, the funny thing was, I think it took a long time for people to realize that Frank was an amazing musician. It's a ridiculously good band.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the rock band that had musicianship up there with the best jazz bands, and you know how rare that is. But
Absolutely.
but the part of the appeal though was Zappa seemed fearless, and he was willing to shake things up, and that was part of the appeal. And you can, if you cleanse that too much, you forget a lot of the meaning, what was really going on there.
You're absolutely right. But I think that he also kind of did it from a perspective of commentary, and that he was making commentary all the time of some of the most absurd, um, the states of society. I mean, kind of in a way that George Carlin or a comedian did. And I think that he didn't necessarily do that to separate himself. Whereas I see a lot of things that are really kind of vulgar just for the sake of getting attention today, whereby people are doing it for that reason, and they may be absolving themselves of responsibility, and it doesn't strike me as commentary as much. In other words, I just see it being done
You know,
for you know what I mean, like different perspective and stuff, and also the sort of things that I think that like if there are things that are really steeped in a certain kind of vulgarity. And I'm not trying to come across here like some sort of Puritan. I'm just trying to sort of uh, you know uh, just having a discussion about it. So that things that remain in the underbelly should remain in the underbelly, and other things, like if they don't remain in the underbelly and they sort of come to the top, and they become mainstream, and now there is no underbelly, it's mainstream. Then if part of the reason for bringing it there was for shock value, then you've completely played all your shock value cards. You see what I'm
well, that
saying?
doesn't, yeah, and you raise a good point, because shocking just for the sake of shocking does not have much of an impact.
Right.
That has an impact of about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Um, and it's sort of funny. My wife and I, we watch not a whole lot of TV or movies, but generally we'll spend, maybe after dinner, we'll get together 45 minutes an hour, we'll watch a movie or a TV show. And I've learned that I have a higher tolerance for things than my wife does. My wife is more easily offended. I'm sure I'm not the only household
Yeah.
where my wife is more easily offended than I am. But even I can be offended too. There's some comedy routines I'll listen to, and I say, I'm sorry, this is too far. But the key thing, and this is the thing, and sometimes though, we'll be watching something and I would think my wife would be offended, but she isn't. And it's because if it's smart, or if it's humor and it's funny, you'll cut people a lot of slack.
Exactly.
But the problem is, if it's just offensive for the sake of being offensive, but I don't have much tolerance for that. And I don't think many people do. But this is the difference. This is what separates an artist. Because you were talking about Frank Zappa.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people were offended by what he did, but he
Right.
was operating at such a high level that if you understood that, okay, well, no, this is, you pay attention to this. This is something that is artistic. This is a cultural commentary. It's not just someone up there spouting off obscenities to stand out.
Right. Exactly.
And that's where when you need to actually make distinctions. That's the one time I feel good being a music critic, which is not the most esteemed profession or vocation in the world. But you do need at some point to make discretion and distinctions.
Yeah.
And understand the difference between these things. It's a profound, when you get down to it, and the cultural impact between the two is quite profound as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, being a part of that whole cultural commentary, delivering that through humor, there's a lot of power in that. Where it kind of sticks because it disarms people, because people may not want to know the truth, and so if you deliver it through humor, then we can also learn to laugh at ourselves. Something that's obviously we're lacking a bit of today, and I think it's affected comedians and affected all sorts of things. Where and Frank was very, very anti-censorship as well. So and for good reason, So so there's that, and yeah, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I mean, having said all this, I mean, do you think that artists, because I mean, one of the basic things you convey that I'm getting just from reading your book right now is the immense power that music has. So having said that, do you think that artists have a responsibility to convey these sociological ideas in a way that does not condone or contribute to an ethical breakdown of society, especially a breakdown that doesn't have an objective or a clear-cut path towards betterment? Because even with the satirical commentary, it was sort of like a way to have us look at ourselves to go, oh yeah, we really are kind of absurd. Maybe we can learn from that, or maybe we can laugh at it. You see what I'm saying?
Well, absolutely. And I'll make a few observations. First of all, about the power of music. And I tell people music changes lives, music changes communities, music changes the world. And sometimes they push back, well, Ted, you're idealistic and you're naive. Maybe 50, 60 years ago, maybe back with Bob Dylan or Joan Baez, maybe back then, music had a social impact, but not anymore. And I wrote an article, published it just a couple of weeks ago, in which I gave 15, 20 different examples of music changing the world right now. Mm-hmm. And so I go into what's happening in Hong Kong with the protesters, where they use, they have all these anthems, these songs they sing. Or if you go to the Middle East or Mali, where musicians are being arrested and going into refugee camps. Mm-hmm. You go into, I'll give you one example. In 2018, a rapper came out with a rap song in Thailand critical of the government. And within a few days, it got tens of millions of views. And it was so popular that the Thai government had to come back with their own response. They actually released their own rap song in which the government and everybody mocked and ridiculed the government's rap song because it wasn't very good. But the bottom line is music still is a very powerful force. And even though you don't read about it in the newspapers, every day, somewhere in the world, a musician is getting arrested or is involved in trying to stop an authoritarian government. And what people don't realize is music has been a very powerful force in expanding human freedom and personal autonomy since the beginning of time. And music doesn't get enough credit for that. Even something as simple as a love song, you'd be amazed at how often love songs expanded human freedom. You know, with the troubadours 1,000 years ago, they sang about love, and it actually gave people more freedom to marry who they wanted, because there was a period where your parents decided who were you going to marry. It was actually the music helped create a culture in which people had some sort of freedom and control over their own lives. So music has always had a power to expand human freedom and defy authoritarianism. But as you mentioned, this puts a responsibility on the shoulders of musicians. Mm-hmm. And musicians shouldn't view that responsibility frivolously. Being a musician, I think, is like a holy priesthood. You are given these enormous powers. You must have seen this a million times, Vinny, and you're in front of an audience. Your drumming is having extraordinary impact. I've studied what drums do to people's brains. People's brain waves match the drum rhythm.
Right.
It's called entrainment. Andrew Neer proved that in 1962, that if you're listening to a drummer, it changes your whole body. And so musicians have responsibilities, and we in the music community have them. We shouldn't take those responsibilities frivolously or treat them as some sort of cavalier thing. Music is more powerful than we realize. And that's a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where if you just look at rhythm, without compartmentalizing, drums and rhythm in any kind of way that's reductionistic, I'm just as an example, just of how that power is utilized. If you take a sampled 808 bass drum and you hear that at a specific BPM going on for an hour or 2 or 3 at a rave, where people are just getting completely messed up. And, that's like one use of it where it's versus the power of rhythm, whereby you even mentioned in your writing how an hour of a drum circle can actually increase your T cell count. So there's a huge difference in use case there.
Oh, Dr. Barry Bittman proved this. Yeah. Participants in a drum circle, their immune system is strengthened. Generally, you have to play at least 10 minutes. Now, what I found interesting is when I studied shamanistic rituals around the world, mm-hmm. the shaman is often in a ritual. Often they're trying to heal someone, or it's a very important ritual. Mm-hmm. And they usually have a drum, mm-hmm. and they fall into a trance. But once again, it usually takes about 10 minutes. And I found this again and again. There seems to be this threshold that, and this is one of the sad things, that our pop songs are generally just 3 minutes long, because all my research indicates that you need at least 5 to 10 minutes before people will really feel that physiological impact. Wow. That's why I'm not surprised that Hey Jude was such a successful Beatles song. One of the reasons why it was successful is it went more than 7 minutes. Well, and that may seem ridiculous, but I have studied the body chemistry. I've done a deep research in the impact of music and especially rhythm on people's bodies, and it is an extraordinary impact. And here's the interesting thing. It can be used for good or bad. I'll give you a very interesting example. Came out of the historian Huizinga. Johann Huizinga. He's a historian about 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. He's studying the medieval period, and he said, in the old days, you went to war as a knight, and it was very individualistic. And that individualism ended, he said, when they brought drummers into the military. Because all of a sudden, everybody had to march to the same beat.
Right.
And so this is the interesting thing. The drums in society are, on the one hand, a force of liberation. You get into a trance, a higher mind state,
right,
altered frame of being, or the drums can be used to impose discipline,
like a herding
so that everybody walks in lockstep.
Yeah, sure.
And I often tell people, I say, show me how someone plays a snare drum, and I can tell you which of these two camps they fall into. Either there's the drums is the path to liberation and freedom, or the drums is the path to total discipline.
Right.
And these are things in music history that people rarely understand, but they have profound significance to a culture. Well, and you tell me the music in a society, and I can tell you by listening to it whether they're furthering authoritarianism or freedom. That may sound too blunt. Well, and maybe I'm exaggerating, but I'm only slightly exaggerating. There's a truth.
Well, I mean, this could be a Pandora's box here. I mean, you've touching a lot of stuff here. Just just in terms of just the drums, like, I mean, I've had extensive rudimental training, which could be said to have come from war drumming. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, no, they send drummers out into battle. The drummer went in. They don't send poets and they don't send the sculptor or the painter into the drummers went out to the battlefield.
Sure, but then it's sort of like, I could use those rudiments and sort of what I think we've done in modern drumming is the drummer would use these rudiments, these military rudiments, as scales, as the sort of drummer's kind of scale. And so we would then learn how to play them on a drum set and recontextualize them so that, those things don't necessarily have a meaning of, well, okay, I can tell that you come from an authoritarian camp. You see what I'm saying? Because they've been recontextualized in a different way, in two ways, actually. A kind of a two-step process where we've turned those things into sort of building blocks of a vocabulary.
Yes.
And secondly, recontextualizing them into grooves or whatever on a drum set.
Sure.
So that's two different things right there. Because and also I wonder on a larger level of how pop music, for example, may have been usurped by big corporate today in order to cause the public or to influence the public to be in lockstep, because it's just all part of a media kind of blitz that may be, or is that, I mean, I'm not sure if this is the right thing to say, that maybe for the purpose of that, but it could be partially for that. You know what I mean? It's like,
No, absolutely. And
there were people, so I don't mean to cut you off, Ted, but there were people, back in the 60s they're anti-establishment singing protest songs that maybe now they were anti-establishment and what they're doing is siding with the establishment. It seems to appear that way.
well, one of the problems we have now, and this is a deep issue, is there's no counterculture.
Yeah.
That we live in sort of a monolithic culture,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not healthy. And in the music world, there's a hypocrisy. And the hypocrisy is that if you interview someone who runs a major record label,
Mm-hmm.
what they tell you is, we're looking for some musicians that have a fresh, new sound that's different and exciting. But in fact, what they really want to sign is somebody who sounds just like what was a hit last week
Yeah.
or
Exactly.
They'll tell you they want something fresh and new, but their behavior tells you something different.
Mm-hmm.
And this has now become internalized in the algorithms, because if you go to Spotify or these playlists or the streaming platforms, they're determined by algorithm, and they will come to me every week and say, Ted, here are the new songs you're going to like. The algorithm has picked these, but the algorithm is merely a feedback loop. It can't tell me about anything different. It can just look at what I liked last week, last month, last year, and try to get me something similar. Right. And so the whole music industry now is acting like these algorithms. The music industry is becoming a feedback loop where everything's going by formula and imitating the past. Now this is my belief, that cannot last. Somebody's going to break us out of this circle, because people, as I've told you, I believe people want music to expand their horizons. I think they want music to shake things up.
Mm-hmm.
I think they want music that sounds fresh and different.
Mm-hmm.
And there's now a divergence between people wanting that and what the music industry gives them, which is, we've reduced everything to a formula and we're going to repeat that formula ad nauseum. Mm-hmm. And even the radio stations all stick to their format.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, if I don't listen to a lot of country music, but when I listen to country music, the radio station's playing songs that sound pretty much the same as 20 years ago. And the pop songs have, I know people are going to kill me for this, but, Lady Gaga isn't all that different from Madonna, and people are, and the hip hop today isn't all that different than the hip hop from 20 years ago. And when I turn to the jazz station, it's usually just the same tracks we were playing. It's not just,
there's
and the classical music.
Yeah.
And so everything is getting into this formula and feedback loop. Mm-hmm. We need something to break us out of this cycle. I'm not sure what it is, but it will come.
Yeah, it feels like it's got to be ready to bust through somehow. I know exactly what you mean, and hopefully that won't be AI because it's all kind of going there, and it's all shifting to that place. And yeah, I mean by the same token, it's like I remember listening to radio stations where there were no formats, and they actually existed, in my lifetime, and just and hearing things, back in the '90s, and thinking, wow, this is where this is going to go. This is where hip hop's going to go, or this is where, electronica is going to go, and it kind of didn't, and if I listen to it qualitatively and really try to be objective about its quality, I have to say, wow, it just really, the quality hasn't really increased. I mean, maybe it has in some ways, and there's just so much stuff coming at us that you have to sift through too much stuff now. And that could be true because of the delivery systems. And having said that, I just want to backtrack here a bit, and I hope I'm not breaking a flow, but we're going back to talking about, the drum circles and the T cells. And speaking of delivery systems and longer form things, it reminds me of records where one entire side of an album was just one track, or for that matter, just having a drum circle, or chanting or something that's repetitive like that, or any number of things that can affect you, in that way. I think it was reflected in music. I mean, they had these long jams. Anything from the Grateful Dead jamming to Live Evil,
Yes,
Miles Davis.
yes.
I mean, these things would go on for like a half an hour, 20 minutes or whatever a side of a record was, 10 minutes, I don't know. And so these long form things happen, and it was just jam and jam, and you would just get entranced in this kind of thing, and that just kind of went away,
But this is interesting, and I tell people the human organism craves the longer song.
Mm.
They say that makes no sense, that all the hits are 3 minutes. I say, well, no, look at this. First of all, when the bands play live, they always make the songs longer, don't they? Because they can see the impact on the audience. They instinctively, the performer sees it. And so generally the live concert, the song goes on for longer than it did on the record. And then if you look at the fan, and this is true, we've done it ourselves. There's some song you like, it's like a 3-minute song, comes to the end. What do? You go back and play it again. Because you don't want it to end after 3 minutes. You really don't.
Right.
And so the music industry has, and why are songs 3 minutes? Well, because it goes back to the 78 RPM albums. They couldn't hold more than 3 minutes on a side. So it was storage disc restrictions that led to the 3-minute song. Right. The music industry at a certain point decided, well, we've been doing this, it must be genius. If we've been doing these 3-minute songs, we're like Einstein.
Sure.
What they don't realize is the bands, the fans, everybody works around this constraint because they want to have that more immersive experience. And obviously someone like Miles doing Live Evil understood that. And a lot of those long tracks, the Grateful Dead understood that at a very high level. They knew that their fans didn't want a 3-minute song. And so the music culture driven by the business is out of touch, I think, in 100 ways with what people really want in their musical experiences. People want music that has a tremendous impact on their life. Many people identify their lifestyle by music. If you ask people, in fact, just think this, hip hop is a genre of music, but it's also a lifestyle. Country is a lifestyle. Jazz is a lifestyle. Punk rock, if someone is a punk, you didn't know if that meant they were a musician or a fan. So people want to have music that has that dramatic impact on their life because music can do that. Many people will go through their whole life, and the only time they'll really have some sort of altered mind state where they're taken at some higher level will be while listening to music. And so we need to take that seriously. I mean, you're, I believe, the practitioner of an extraordinary vocation. And people, and if they treat you just like an entertainer, and I'm sure you're a great entertainer, I'm sure you know exactly how to entertain, but if they treat you as just an entertainer, they don't even begin to understand what you do when you go on the stage.
Yeah, exactly. And I've never really given much attention to developing an entertainment aspect of it, but I point taken, and I just wonder whether or not all of those things that you had mentioned that are lifestyles that you could look at each genre as a lifestyle. If the diversity was also like I often talk about the zeitgeist of the 60s versus the zeitgeist now that shapes the kind of music that comes out as commentary. And I just wonder if diversity was more of the zeitgeist of that time as well, and try to look at all those kind of societal influences and compare it to now and just I've lost my train of thought on that one. I was going somewhere with it, but
yeah, but there, and I guess where I come down is, I think the music scene is still very vibrant and exciting, but it's not happening at the surface level anymore. You have to dig deeper. Yeah. And I devote 2 to 3 hours a day listening to new music. That's because it's part of my. So in the course of any given year, I'll listen to more than 1,000 newly released albums.
Amazing.
And I found that I still hear good music, but it's almost never from a major label. It's almost always an indie project or a self-produced project or something I wouldn't hear I'm not going to hear on TV. And so they're young, and I worry that the people are doing creative work and they're getting lost. It's like finding a needle in a haystack.
Exactly.
I don't know what the solution to that is. I know that I can only do so much. I mean, I try to highlight good music I hear, but this is a large task. It's important to our culture.
Yeah, it is important to our culture, and I think that with the democratization of it and the sort of just letting all the floodgates open, and we can get music anywhere, all the time, everywhere, and that's the sort of downside. We got to dig so hard, and those things, they may not stick either, and it's just they're not sticky anymore. It's not. There's like a loss of permanence and all that sort of thing as well. It was just so transient, but there's definitely no lack of great music out there. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. I mean, talent, and there's just so much stuff out there. I just wonder what kind of you remember the kind of sociological impact that jazz had, back in the 50s and 60s. I just wonder if that's going to ever sort of get to the point where it sort of comes back and grabs people and makes a comeback on another level, because society was, we were used to getting that stuff mainstream. I remember seeing that stuff like, on the Steve Allen show. He had a TV show, and he had Miles Davis on. It was one of the best performances I've ever seen. And this was prime time television. This wasn't something you had to search for,
Absolutely. No, and it's interesting. Let's go back to the late 1950s, and the counterculture in the United States. So a group of people known as beatniks.
Yeah, right.
And I got this magazine here from Life magazine, 1959, estimating that there are 10,000 beatniks in the United States, and they're leaders of the counterculture. One of the things that the beatniks did is they would listen to jazz. This was one of the few things that they knew about the beatniks. They listened to jazz. And it's very funny. There was a TV show back then called Dobie Gillis.
I remember that. There
was a character on there, Maynard G. Krebs was a beatnik, played by the same guy who would later do Gilligan. And he always shows bongos and he'd have a beard and he was sort of goofy. And this was the TV image of the beatnik. But this was the only time on network television that anyone said the word Thelonious Monk, because occasionally Maynard G. Krebs on the show would mention the name Thelonious Monk. But the counterculture was affiliated with a musical style. Now, this is what's very interesting, is you fast forward a decade later and you have hippies. And the hippies are in many ways like the beatniks. Now, they're listening to rock music too. Mm-hmm. but the way they dress, their attitudes, the counterculture vibe is the same. But now this has gone mass market.
Mm-hmm.
There are millions of hippies and people practicing these lifestyles. So this is, now, could that happen again? Well, it absolutely could. It absolutely could. And I think my parents' generation, I mean, I was very young at the hippie thing. I was too young to be a hippie. I was still a kid. My parents' generation were shocked by this, but this was a huge social movement that changed everything.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually had tens of millions of people. Maybe they didn't all wear the beads and the psychedelic clothes, but attitudinally, they aligned themselves with this movement, and it couldn't have happened without the music.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is going to happen again. Now, the fact that I can't tell you the exact details of how doesn't mean it's not going to happen, because it's happened. This is where I have an advantage as a music historian. This has happened for 5,000 years.
Yeah.
And generally, this is the interesting thing. How do you know that a new revolution in music is going to come? And I've studied it, and it's always when things look very bland and boring is exactly when the revolution is going to come. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to the early 50s. This is 5 years before Elvis. The record industry was just doing these pop albums, mood music albums. They had these things called bachelor pad albums, where you go to your bachelor pad with the music in the background. Novelty songs like How Much Is That Doggy in the Window?
Right.
You had the high end of that was like Sinatra and whatever, but there was a bunch of this just sort of pop music. And it was very, and it was very formulaic. And the record industry said, well, we've now reached the nirvana. We know what people want. They want gentle pop music, sweet love songs,
sure,
bachelor pad music. But in fact, something was going to come and totally shake things up. It was rock and roll. And it had all the more impact because it came at a time when things were very static and there wasn't a lot of change in the music industry. We are in that static point right now. Something's going to come and will shake us out of this.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I mean, I was thinking more along the lines of, well, all of this chaos happened, and the counterculture protest songs and all the sort of stuff that came out of that whole miasma that was happening in the 60s during all of that, and we're now not only in the past 2 years, but especially right now at this very moment in another period that is providing a kind of an equal amount of tension, if not, a sort of potential amount of chaos. So I was thinking that what you were going to say is that might be something that births this kind of disruptive thing that maybe catches on. But yeah, I mean, it could come from just the banal sort of stagnation and boredom, and just sort of, something's got to give. I get what you're saying.
I remember in the late 1970s, I got a scholarship to go to Oxford, which was a great thing because I came from a working class family. We had no money. And this gave me, go to Oxford and study philosophy. And so I'm studying philosophy, and at night I'm playing jazz. I'm gigging with I've got this is a great life I had there. I'm like studying philosophy during the day, and I'm doing jazz gigs at night.
Yeah. And
I remember there was this rumor that punks were going to come to Oxford. And one day I'm walking down the street, and all of a sudden there are a bunch of these punks, and they're like skinheads, and the ones with the hairdo that looks like the rooster, and with the body piercings, and they're like about 100 of them have gathered in this square in the town, and they're on one side. The other side is the police, and the police has got their riot gear on.
Oh.
And the police are watching the punks. The punks are watching the police. I'm walking to the middle of the square, and I look at this, and I look, and I says, I got to get out of here. This thing is going to blow. I don't know what's going on here, but right. This thing is going to blow up. But here's the interesting thing about that video. The punk movement was a music movement.
Yes.
Basically, a change in the music Now, I'm not into riot. I mean, I'm the last person in the world to riot. I had very little interest in the punk thing. I later gained some appreciation of the punk thing as a music historian. But back then, I was living in my esoteric jazz world. You know, if it didn't have a million chord changes, I didn't pay any, I paid no attention to it.
Right.
And all of a sudden, I'm thrust into something like that. And I just said, no, I'm not into punk rock, but I have to respect the power of a music that is shaking things up at this level.
Yeah.
I have to respect that.
Yeah.
And that's where I also say, as musicians and people in the music community, or me as a music writer, we have to take that seriously, because you could a musician can light a torch that can burn down a city, or can give light to a whole world. And so I want to be among the people that brings light to the world and doesn't burn things down.
Amen.
But people don't look at music in that regard, but I do. I do think music is one of those forces, and it has lost none of its power. The fact that right now we don't see that kind of dramatic musical culture it's just an aberration, because it will come back.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the human spirit warrants it, and it will happen as a result of the longing coming out of the human spirit. It's just part of our humanity.
Yeah.
It just is. So yes, so be that, Ted. So be it. Amen to that. And that's very, very, very enlightening. And I think that, really that's just a great thought to close this wonderful conversation on. It really is. It's a wonderful thing to think of. It sort of gives hope, and I think it's an important thing. What regardless of what people may or may not say, there's always pushback to almost everything. People talk about hope, and I'm a fan. I'll take it. Don't take hope away. It just reminds me of Viktor Frankl. You're talking about man's search for meaning. It's like, they can take all of that stuff away except his attitude toward it, and music may arise out of one of those most dire circumstances, again, some sort of disruptive thing, because as you were well saying before, we're talking about music fulfilling a function versus just an artistic expression, hence the war chants, or hence the anthems, or hence these, that, and the other things. But the disruptive force may also give birth to a new dimension of the art form of music as well. So hopefully, that will happen. And again, I can't recommend your book highly enough. I've been diving into it, and I'm just voraciously. I'll be finishing it in the next couple of days, I'm sure. It's a great book, and I can't recommend it highly enough. A Subversive History of Music, A Subversive History by Ted Gioia. And Ted, thank you so much for taking the time to be on this show. I can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you. This was fun. I've been a long time admirer of yours, and so this is a real treat for me.
Oh.
So thank you very much, and let's do it again sometime.
Thanks, Ted. Absolutely.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for the next episode of Breakfast with Vinny.